Hey Woodlands, Pastor Daniel with you. Wanted to come just together with you on this video and just wrap up 1 Corinthians chapter 11, specifically the first half. And if you remember this, 2 weeks ago we did the first half of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, dealing with head coverings, and kind of coming out of that section of scripture, quite a few questions arose, which was a good thing. And I answered a number of your questions live in person on that Sunday morning. And I also had a number of other questions come in that I didn't have time to answer. And so I wanted to circle back to these questions and just kind of finish up 1 Corinthians chapter 11, answer these questions and kind of put a bow on it. And I also wanted to reinforce a couple of points about relationship and marriage that came out of this section. And so just as a reminder, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the first half is about head coverings. And it's about women wearing head coverings in gatherings of the church. We learned that while Paul was instructing the Corinthians about head coverings, we learned that for the church today, the principles that are being communicated by Paul are really more about authority and headship, the way that God has created things, the way that God has ordered things, and the way that God has designed things. In those first couple of verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we learn that God is the head of Christ because Christ chose to submit to God on the cross. We learn that Christ is the head of man, meaning that man should choose, and if he wants to live by God's design, and if he wants to thrive in God's design, that he will choose to submit to Christ. And the same is true in our earthly relationships. God has designed man to be the head of the marriage, the family, and the church. And woman is called to submit to God's order and God's design and God's creation, to the headship and the authority of man. If you want to listen to a little bit more in depth on this, you can go back and find this sermon on our YouTube channel and listen to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the first half. But what I really wanted to get to is these questions. And so question number one is this: if the head of the man is Christ, could then not covering your head in prayer be an allegory for always approaching God in prayer through Christ? And so the question here is that in the Old Testament, people who believed in God needed an intermediary, a person in between them and God. Now coming in to approach the throne of God, to approach God in prayer, even in animal sacrifice, you needed this intermediary between you and God. Now, coming into the New Testament, Jesus comes on the scene. He is the Son of God. He is crucified on the cross. And if you remember the biblical account of that, as Jesus surrenders his life on the cross, it says that the curtain in the temple is torn in two. And the symbolism there is that no longer do we, as Christians who follow Jesus, no longer do we need an intermediary. We can pray to God. We can have a relationship with God. We can take communion, as we talked about last Sunday, between us and God without a man or a woman needing to play that intermediary role. And so the question here could there be something symbolic about men taking off their head covering, meaning that I no longer need an intermediary between me and God, but now God and I are connected. I'll say this: I think if nothing else, we can draw that conclusion that there is some symbolism to take to men no longer having to wear a head covering, because we in man and woman in our culture, for that matter, because now we don't need that intermediary. We can connect with God in relationship, in prayer, in communion, in worship, in all of those things without someone in between us. And so, yes, I think there is symbolism or allegory there. Does the Bible draw that specific conclusion? No, not necessarily. But I think it's an okay symbol for us to latch onto and say, I no longer need this, because I am now connected with God. Second question, as a single person or one that is dating, how can I apply this to my life? And so the question here is that within this relational dynamic of authority and headship, and the way that God created man and woman and put man in headship and called woman the helper, the paraclete, the supporter. And again, remember, there's no value statement here. One is not better than the other. Man and woman were both created in God's image. But the question is, how does a single person who is not married apply this or live in this? And so a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, first and foremost, if you're single, you can still live according to these principles in the church, honoring that God has chosen man to be the head of the church, that God has chosen man to be the pastors and the elders of the church. This does not mean that women cannot serve in the church. Women have a very important part to play and role in the church. There are places in which they can lead and they can direct, and they do at Woodlands Church. But God definitely ordained man into that headship, pastoral, elder role. And so I think as a woman in the church, one of the ways that you can apply this principle is by following God's design in the church for headship and authority. Secondarily, I think when you're talking about relationship, marriage, dating, those sorts of things, the way that you apply it to your life as you're preparing for relationship, marriage, and family is, number one, you should be looking for a God-fearing man who he himself is living according to the design that God has made. Is the man that you are interested in or dating or in a relationship with, is he submitting to Christ? Is he submitting to God? This is going to be very important for your relationship, your marriage, and your family down the road. And so I think that's one of the primary ways you can apply this now. And even in your dating relationship, though you're not married, you should be allowing the man that you're dating to be leading in your relationship spiritually. And if he's not doing that, even in your dating relationship, then you can't necessarily expect him to do that in your marriage or your family. And so that might raise a yellow flag. Well, I'm interested in this man. He seemed like a godly man, but there are areas of his life where he's not submitted to Christ and he's not leading me spiritually, even in this dating relationship. And so I think that's a couple of the ways that you can apply these principles to your life, and particularly as you get engaged. You begin, even though you're not married yet, you can begin to practice godly submission to your soon-to-be husband as he is practicing loving you like Jesus loved the church. I think there was also a secondary question that came in here about someone who is widowed, and I think everything I said applies. Is that though you may be widowed and you no longer have a husband, I think you can still be applying Paul's principles from 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in your life as you're serving in the church. And then I think as you might have a role as a mentor for a younger woman. You might be discipling younger women. And one of the ways that I think you can apply this principle is by sharing these godly biblical roles and designs that God has set up and teaching them what biblical submission looks like and what it looks like for a man to allow Christ to lead him. Excuse me. Third question. Why don't women have to follow Paul's judgment to wear head coverings? So my sermon really revolved around this, but what I've learned is through some conversations I've had is that I wasn't totally abundantly clear about why Paul would tell the Corinthians to wear head coverings, but why we as American Christians don't have to, and specifically women. And so let me just give you just a really simple and clear answer here. Head coverings were a cultural and traditional item for women to wear that symbolized that this woman was married and that she was choosing to honor, respect, and submit to her husband. In today's terms, in our culture and our traditions, head coverings no longer symbolize marriage or submission. The things in our day and age that cover or symbolize a marriage, honor, submission would be things like changing a last name or wearing a wedding ring. And so it's not necessary for women who are married in the church today to wear a head covering, because this cultural tradition was something that the early church did, not something that was commanded, but it was a tradition. And I think that's the real big difference to understand. And if you go back and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, you'll even see that Paul uses that word tradition, I think twice in that passage. So this isn't a command for the church globally forever. It's a tradition that was handed down in the Corinthian church, and Paul tells the Corinthian Christians that they should continue to follow this tradition, largely because there was issues with authority and headship and leadership in the Corinthian church, and Paul wanted them to respect and honor, again, not just the physical act of the head covering, but he wanted them to honor the authority, the headship, and the leadership that God had designed and created. Question number 4 wasn't really a question, but it was more of a statement or a quote. A younger man in the church sent this to me. He wrote, "Marriage is only as strong as the man. The family is only as strong as the marriage. The church is only as strong as the family. The country is only as strong as the church. As goes the man, so goes the marriage. As goes the marriage, so goes the family. As goes the family, so goes the church. As goes the church, so goes the country." I think we all understand the sentiment here, which is, as God has created, ordained, and designed man as the headship and the authority figure in marriage, in family, in church, and even in the country, that the health of the headship and the authority of the man flows down into all of the rest of the things we're talking about here. So the spiritual, emotional, physical health of the man will have some determination on the health of the marriage. The health of the marriage obviously has a determination on the health of the family. The health of the family has a determination on the health of the church, and the health of the church has a lot to do with even our country and our world. And so I think we would all agree with that sentiment. And I appreciate this young man sending this to me, because I think what comes out of this passage in this whole idea is less about women wearing head coverings, and really it's far more about the role that the man has been given and the great responsibility that man has been given to lead well, to be a spiritual creature, to be submitted to Christ, to be following God's word, to be led by the Spirit. And men who are watching, and ladies, if you're watching this by yourself, man, take a few minutes and sit with your husbands later and maybe watch this together, because I think there's some things that your husbands need to hear, which is this: husbands, like your marriage will only be as good as your relationship with God is. If you ignore the Lord, you ignore your spiritual health, you ignore the church, you ignore Bible study, you ignore your prayer, if you ignore all of those things, you can't expect to have a healthy, happy, joy-filled marriage or family. You need to be investing in your relationship with the Lord. You need to be a man of God's word. You need to be a man of prayer. You need to be a man submitted to Christ. You need to be a man who's leading his family to church, not a man whose wife is dragging him to church. You need to be the leader there. You need to be taking your wife to home group, not having your wife dragging you to home group. You want your marriage to thrive. You want to have a fulfilling marriage. You want things that are broken in your marriage and your family to be healed. It starts with you. And secondarily, coming out of your relationship with God, God will stir in you this supernatural love for your wife that maybe, if you're honest with yourself, maybe you've lost that a little bit. And going back to that Ephesians passage where Paul says, wives, you are to submit to your husbands, but he also says, husbands, you are to love your wives like Christ loved the church. That's not possible without a thriving relationship with God. Okay? Like, you cannot love your wives in a supernatural way, in the way that Christ loved the church, laid his life down for the church, without your relationship with God in the right place. Okay? And so it all starts and ends there. And I want to add just one little last piece to this, men. I think when we talk about being men who love their wives, right? Being committed to our wives and to our families, we think in physical ways, right? We think my role as a man to love my wife like Christ loved the church is to provide for them and to protect them. I think men are physical beings, and so we oftentimes think in much more physical ways. So we think my role to love them is to provide for them and protect them. And you know what? If that's how you feel, you're absolutely right. But that is far from the only way that you need to love your wife. You absolutely need to be providing. You absolutely need to be protecting. But if all you're doing in your week, right, is you're working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, you're commuting 2 hours back and forth, Saturdays you're going to the gym all day, Sundays you're playing golf, and you're leaving your wife and your family at home, and you are not present, but you're providing them a good paycheck, a good life, and a good home. You've actually abandoned your wife and your family by doing that. Okay, your wife needs you present physically, but she also needs you present emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. This is the way in which you can lay down your life for your wife. This is the way you can love your wife like Christ loved the church, is not by just being a good provider and a good protector, but being present physically, being present emotionally, being present relationally, and being present spiritually, and fulfilling those needs that she has beyond being protected and provided for. So don't miss that. Don't miss that, men. I hope this is cleared up and just helped us wrap up 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm always available to you, church. And so most of you all have my phone number. If you don't have my phone number, you can get a hold of me through email, through the church's website, through social media, or just find me on Sunday morning, and I would love to talk to you more about any of these issues. With that, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I will see you Sunday for just another wonderful gathering and time with the Lord.